Everyone. Today is seminar number 3 as part of our Uprooting Inequity series. It's been a true joy to be able to partner up with Ayo Magwood, who's been supporting OEDI's work around the concepts, the knowledge that we need to advance, how to become an anti-racist institution, what do we need to look at to improve campus climate and culture for everyone here, and how do we think about this history of our country when it comes to race, and what can we do to apply it in our everyday work. So for recap, for those of you, if this is the first time joining, in our first session, we saw the social construction of race and how they are supported and codified by our government and economic interests. In session number 2, we saw the intentional creation of the concept of race neutrality and to a sophisticated way it challenges and shapes how we advocate for anti-racism, equity, and justice. By learning how race correlates with so many different social conditions, we identify that inequities fostered before the civil rights movement keep an equity gap alive and pervasive. We also saw how geographic segregation and the lack of access to wealth have supported heartbreaking outcomes, realities we see with rate outcome correlation within healthcare, environmental justice, education, and so much more. So today we start to link these historical origins to make sense of the term structural racism, because to know and understand how it works is to know and understand how to redesign it. So before we get started with our formal presentation, I wanna provide some space and go over our land acknowledgement. Thank you, Ayo. So our land acknowledgement reads, local indigenous people, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who understand the earth as a place for everyone, first inhabited the lands where UC Merced is located. When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backward, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century and the importance of diversity in addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring a reconciliatory path of redress for the future. The most prominent path on our campus is called Scholars Lane. By day, you can see, hear, and witness the embodiment of our diversity through campus community members making their way across campus, framed by the slopes and peaks of the Sierra Nevada. And we start our presentation with our land acknowledgement to encourage this type of reflection. 1, what intentions do you have to disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond this land acknowledgement? And 2, what is your organization doing beyond the acknowledging whose land and labor allow you to live, work, and or learn in that space? Thank you. So as we embark on today's conversations, I do want to continue to frame how we want to engage with one another. So this space here is specifically designed to provide our community with the foundations needed to astutely build an anti-racist strategy. There is a rationale why we believe Ayo Magwood's seminars are critical for our work within OEDI and our campus community at large. So we know we're gonna grow. And as we do, it is even more vital that we interweave our EDI values into academic affairs, student affairs, our business units, and our organizational decision-making process. With that though, the organization comes alive with the people that work here. So you are critical in this transformative work. And discussions of racism, its pervasiveness, and how it shows up in your day are extremely difficult. We know that it's a lot of emotions, a lot of healing, a lot of pain. But to help process today's content, please honor the following guidelines, community guidelines. 1, share the airspace. For engagement, it's really critical to listen and hear one another, step forward and step back as needed. 2, reflect and participate in the chat. Wherever your mind goes as you listen and process this information is totally valid. What becomes increasingly important is how we're able to witness and share that space with you as you're also processing something we're going through together. 3, process, whether at home, in the chat, in the discussion. It can be when you're watching your favorite TV show, it can be when you're driving to work or wherever you may be. But this idea of doing equity-minded work is a lifelong journey. And to process is to understand those moments to realize, this might be the way that I can contribute to our anti-racist culture. And 4th, remember that the goal is to bring all of the work that Ayo's bringing to us and the reflections that we do, hence putting in the work, into our daily practice. So we do know that for session number 7, it's really opening up that mentality and space around what are we going to do now? Ayo set the foundations. So remember, through reflection and linking it back to your day-to-day experiences, it increases our capacity to move UC Merced towards equity and justice. Thank you, Ayo. I'm gonna pass it back to you.
Okay. So here are the seminar logistics and expectations that I have to building on the UC Merced communications expectations. First of all, in the chat, write your clarifying questions in the chat and someone will communicate them to me, especially if you have clarifying questions about what I'm saying at that time. So I'd rather clear them up rather than you be confused. So don't wait until the end. And I'm not going to check the chat until the breaks, but feel free to communicate with other participants. I strongly encourage you that you use the note-taking outline that I've provided for you. The material is dense and complex, so I strongly encourage you using active learning strategies like note-taking and asking questions and discussing rather than just listening, which is passive learning. So when you're just listening, it's just going to go in one ear and out the other. So please take notes using the outline provided in the Word doc. And second of all, please share your thoughts in the chat when I request at the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to ask everyone to participate, to share their thoughts, any thought in the chat. This will allow us to hear all the voices in the room, even the ones that are shy about speaking up, and we can get a quick view, read of the entire room. So I'm going to, just giving you a heads up, I'm going to expect everyone to share their thoughts in the chat when we finish, okay? We're also going to have 4 2-minute brain breaks within the presentation, plus at the very end, we'll have a 5th brain break right before we start our discussion. During these 2-minute brain breaks, I'm going to count 30 seconds to rest our brain. We don't do anything, we're just quiet and then silent. And then we'll have 90 seconds for active processing in our notes, that Word doc that I referred to. And just and this is what the end of the discussion is going to look like. I'm going to show this screen and you're going to be asked to share your thoughts and takeaway in the chat, and we would like 100% participation, and after that we'll open it up for the discussion. Okay, so just say you weren't you can't say you weren't warned, right? And this is what, when I say when I refer to that outline, that I'd like you to take notes on your outline in the Word doc, this is what it looks like, just in case you haven't received it yet. The link is in the chat. And by the way, can you reshare the link in the chat for those who arrived later? Because you know you can't see what's in the chat, what happened in the chat before you got here. So can you just please reshare that? But the link will take you to here. And you notice right here, we're in seminar 3, and there are the notes right there. You can download them if you haven't downloaded them before, but they'll look like here, like they do on the left. And you see, this is an outline, so it helps you follow along. And I encourage you to take your notes within it. Since it's a Word doc, you can just insert your notes underneath the appropriate section, and it will help you process and understand and take away and remember a lot more, retain a lot more of the information. Okay, because there's, I'm sure you know this from your university classes, but we only remember 10% of what we read and 20% of what we hear, but we remember 70% of what we say and write. So that's why we take notes. And when we're taking notes, we're trying to distinguish the main idea from supporting evidence, summarizing the main ideas in your notes, making connections to prior knowledge, identifying cause and effect, identifying patterns, asking questions, and discussing. That's what the active learning is. When we say, well, 70% what we write, we don't mean just dictation, right? It's not just the copying down in the words, but it's rather this thinking, these connections that we're making, where we're asking ourselves questions and forcing ourselves to distinguish the main idea and summarize the main ideas on words. That's what we mean by active processing. And this is where the real learning goes on. This is what helps our brain really understand it and retain the information. So I strongly encourage you to use the notes for this option. And that's why I'm going to be giving you protected time, right? 4 times in the presentation. At the end, you're going to have protected time to go to do this. Okay. Now, last time we went over the historical reproduction of anti-Black racism. I'm going to give you a really quick overview, a summary of what we learned, just to refresh your memory, because it does feed on into this presentation. So we learned last time that the Civil Rights Acts were not nearly as effective as portrayed in the media and in the US history books, because they never repaired the accumulated gains of past discrimination. So remember, we said it was sort of like a monopoly game where Blacks weren't allowed to participate for centuries, right? And then they say, okay, you can join in. But of course, whites who have been participating already have tons of money from the bank that they've accumulated, and houses and hotels and houses, and none of that is, the new people aren't given any of those. So and these accumulated gains of past discrimination, these continue to impact the present day, as we're going to see today, through the racial wealth gap and residential and school segregation. We're going to see today that the foundations of contemporary present-day structural racism are the racial wealth gap and residential school segregation. We also learned last time that throughout US history, prohibited forms of racial discrimination have repeatedly been reproduced in different forms, in more legal and morally acceptable forms. So once one form is prohibited, fine, we'll just find another way of doing the same thing, accomplishing the same thing. For example, they often come up with ostensibly race neutral policies. They look on paper, on the face of it, they look like they're race neutral, but they're not racist, but they have a racially disparate impact on Blacks and often a Latinx community, because they're based on either wealth or geography. And as we learned, wealth and geography are the two principal ways that there have been, that historical discrimination continues to have an impact on today. And so therefore, wealth and geography act as proxies for race. It's as substitutes. Like they say wealth and geography, but they might as well be saying race, right? And we also learned that this reproduction is enabled by the conservative reinterpretation of colorblindness. Colorblindness used to mean that original definition of colorblindness is that, you know, everyone should be should have equal outcomes. But conservatives have managed to reinterpret colorblindness to mean that we should we should treat the law should officially, legally treat everybody the same, even though it has different outcomes on different people and different races. And we also learned that this is sort of papered over and rationalized or justified with these misleading political and cultural narratives like the American dream, equal opportunity, racial economic progress, post-racial America. These myths cover up and make this possible. Okay, so now we're going on today, we're going to learn about the causes and impacts of structural racism, which is tied to that historical reproduction. So the reason why we're learning about structural racism today, and by the way, I'm going to show this image when we finish, because this is hopefully going to trigger some discussion, is we can't dismantle a black box. So structural racism, lots of times for most of us, is a black box where we know that it produces disparities in outcomes, outcomes in wealth, disparities in wealth, disparities in college graduation rates, et cetera, that are not fully explained by socioeconomic, cultural, and behavioral differences. And we know that structural racism exists, but we don't know how it works. How does it produce those disparities? How does it work? How does it manifest in the UC Merced, in employment, in education, in the criminal justice system? We don't know exactly how it works. So that's what we're going to learn today, the mechanics of how it manifests, okay? So, but before we start, there's 3 qualifiers. In your outlines, this is section 0, because it's before we start, okay? So the first qualifier is that today we're distinguishing between settled empirical questions versus open policy questions. What are those, I'm sure you're asking? Well, empirical questions are questions that have a single right or wrong answer that can be discovered through scientific study. Empirical questions are considered settled versus open when there's broad-based agreement, when there's a consensus on the answer among credible experts in the field. Hess and McAvoy, which are these education researchers, teach that it is inauthentic and problematic to treat a settled empirical question as open. In other words, to debate them. On the other hand, policy questions are open, debatable opinion questions without a right or wrong answer. Intelligent, informed people disagree on that answer, usually depending on their political ideology. So what does it have to do with race or racism? Well, does structural racism exist today, or systemic racism or institutional racism? Well, that is a settled empirical question. Versus, what, if anything, should the government do about structural racism? So in this category would be, should we have affirmative action? Should we have reparations? Should we defund the police? All of those are policy questions. There is no right or wrong answer. People have very different opinions on it based on their ideology, and we should debate that. We don't debate the first, we should debate the second. So today's discussion, some presentation, is on structural racism. It is a settled empirical question. I'm going to show you the data on it, but that does not mean I'm saying anything about the latter, okay? So note also that there is lots of other settled empirical questions that are controversial. Just because it's controversial doesn't mean that it's not settled. For example, did the Holocaust take place? Is climate change occurring? Do vaccines cause autism? Lots of questions about COVID. And does systemic structural racism exist? Some members of the public disagree, quote unquote, and think it's controversial. That does not mean that these are not settled empirical questions. According to social scientists, according to researchers, according to scientists, there is a consensus. There's an answer to this. It is still settled and empirical. And notice that a settled empirical question doesn't require universal agreement to be considered settled. In fact, you'd be hard pressed to find universal agreement on any question, even hard science questions, right? There's always going to be a few people. All you need is a consensus among the majority of credible, relevant scholars. If a preponderance of the evidence supports a certain answer. Okay, so that means that even if somebody finds, I don't know, a dozen studies that say that structural racism doesn't exist, sorry, Charlie, it's still a settled, the question of structural racism is still a settled empirical question because the consensus is that it exists. So again, how do we know it's a settled empirical question? So there's a ton of data, but also most mainstream economic agencies and organizations and businesses in the country agree. For example, all 12 of the Federal Reserve banks, McKinsey and Company, which is a very mainstream consulting firm, Citibank, all these refer to structural or systemic racism as a fact. And the data on it, the evidence, is we can think about the evidence in three ways. That you can assume that you can conclude that structural racism exists if you find data that demonstrates the presence of racial disparities across sectors, meaning housing, education, etc., that are not explained by socioeconomic differences, nor by cultural and behavioral differences. And there is evidence for all of this. The reason why this setup is because you will see that some conservatives will say, oh, structural racism doesn't exist. Sure, there's obviously tons of racial disparities, but they're actually due to class rather than race. They're actually due to socioeconomic or levels of education. Or they'll say it's because Blacks don't work hard or don't value hard work or whatever the ridiculous thing is. So that's why if you prove all of these, then you have to conclude that structural racism does exist. The second point qualifier I want to make before I start is that structural inequities are influential. I am not saying that they're determinate. Okay, for disparities in outcomes are a product of 4 factors, not just structural inequities. So your success depends partly on individual skill and intelligence. And your success is also partially determined by your individual effort and hard work. So these would be considered individual merit, right? And also societal privileges and inequities have a huge influence on your success or your outcomes, right? But then also just random luck also has a play. So there's all 4 of these factors are going to help influence your success and outcome. So when we're talking about structural racism, I am not claiming that it is the sole determining factor, okay? It's one of several factors. So in other words, lack of privilege alone doesn't necessarily explain lack of success. And privilege is not enough. Merit and hard work are equally critical ingredients of success. However, merit and hard work are often not enough. Success is much less likely when you don't also have privilege. Okay, and the third qualifier before I start is obviously structural racism is only one of several intersecting structural inequities. The two biggest ones usually are structural poverty and structural racism. I like to call them the two big evils. And there's lots of intersection, right? So low-income Blacks would suffer from both. And the effect is not just additive, it's actually multiplicative. And depending on the time and the place and the context, there's other types of structural inequity: structural sexism, structural homophobia and transphobia, which is usually called institutional homophobia, by the way, structural ableism, structural xenophobia. I'm sure you can think of others. Those are just some examples. And in fact, a lot of what you're going to learn today is also applicable to the other structural inequities. Okay, so we're ready to start. So today we're going to learn what is structural racism, the concept. How does structural racism differ from individual bias? And then we're going to see how structural racism works in practice, how it manifests in several sectors. And then finally, we're going to look at the role of individual bias and opportunity hoarding. So let's first do structural racism, the concept. So back to REI, the Racial Equity Institute, they were the ones that posited the way that you can prove the evidence you have to show to prove that structural racism exists. They also have a lovely metaphor for structural racism. It's their metaphor, but it's called the Groundwater Approach, but I've just illustrated it because I like pictures, I like images, okay? So if one fish dies in the lake, it makes sense to analyze the fish. What is wrong with it? If half the fish in the lake die, it makes sense to analyze the lake. What is wrong with it? But if half the fish in all the nearby lakes die, it makes sense to analyze the groundwater. Similarly, schools. If one student fails in the educational sector, we analyze the individual student. Did that student work hard enough? Are they getting the support they need at home? But if half the students are failing in the educational sector, we analyze I'm having tech issues. We analyze the entire educational sector. Might the sector itself be causing such consistent, unacceptable outcomes for students? But what if many of these students and their families are disproportionately struggling in other sectors which intersect with each other? Then we need to analyze the entire system. And then I have a third metaphor for you. This is not from REI, this is from C.P. Jones. So she explains that when she moved to Baltimore, there were two flower pots on her front porch. One had soil in it, the other one was empty. So she went out and bought some nice new, nice quality soil and put it in the new flower pot, in the empty flower pot. And then she purchased flower seeds and put them into both plots, the same flowers. And lo and behold, the flowers grew strong and vibrant in the flower pot with the new soil. And they grew but very weakly and not as plentifully in the old flower pot. And she realized that the new soil was of much better quality. The other soil was depleted of its nutrients. And so she realized that this was a wonderful metaphor for structural racism. So what we mean by structural racism, we're the structural is in contrast to the individual. So we can see that the outcome or success of the flowers depended not just on the individual flower seed, the quality and how hard that individual seed worked, but also in the soil, right? The soil, we can think of that soil just like we can think of that groundwater or the system as structural racism. Okay, and so we see that outcomes are due to both individual and systemic factors. Another term that we will often hear used is systemic racism. Basically, they're synonyms. Most people don't really know the difference, and there's a huge overlap. So you can go right ahead and use them as synonyms. But there's a slight difference in them, is that structural, again, is contrasting with individual, right? Individual versus structural factors. It's referring to policies and practices and culture, okay? When people use the word systemic, they're often emphasizing that structural inequities in one sector, for example, housing, can also affect structural inequities and outcomes in other sectors. Like they're all connected, like in these gears, right? It's a system with all these different interlocking gears. So that's that's what systemic racism means, very technically. But again, we can use them as synonyms because it's obviously racism is both structural and systemic. So we can think of structural inequity as prejudice plus power. So here I'm going to give my formal definition of structural inequity. It is in your notes, so you don't have to scramble to write it down. We can think of structural inequity as an interconnected web of government policies, economic rules and practices, political cultural narratives, looks at culture, right, and politics, and social norms that result in systemic or systematic disparities in power, status, and outcomes across sectors, meaning housing, education, et cetera, that are not explained by individual merit and that are predominantly rooted in the persistent legacies of historical state-sanctioned discrimination that we saw from last time, the segregation and the historical racial wealth gap. Whether intentional or not, does not have to be intentional. Okay, this will make a lot more sense after we see many, many examples in this presentation. But I also want to emphasize the really important role of the persistent legacies of historical state-sanctioned discrimination. That really emphasizes, that really sets structural inequity apart from, for example, bias. And so just a summary of that, if you take away, because that's a lot of words, just remember policies and practices, culture rooted in a history of discrimination. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to do our first 2-minute brain break. So first, I'm going to put the timer on for 30 seconds, and we're going to be silent. And then just rest your brain. And then we're going to have 90 seconds for active processing in your notes. So in your notes, you can do any one of these. You could choose to summarize a main idea in your own words. You could identify important new ideas you learned so far, or you could note areas where you would like additional clarification, where you have questions or you're a little confused or you'd like some more details. Okay, so first we'll do the 30 seconds. Okay, now I would like you to do some active processing in your notes. I strongly encourage you to go through your notes and not check Facebook or something else. Go. Okay, time. So now we're going to go on to the next section. How does structural racism differ from individual bias? This is going to be pretty short. So you might recall that bias consists of both in-group favoritism. We favor people that we identify as one of our in-group, and we have bias against people that we identify as being a member of our out-group. So prejudice is negative bias, by the way. And bias is leftover. It's a vestigial tendency that evolved during prehistoric times, you might recall. So during prehistoric times, it was very helpful to have bias. Those of them who favored their own and were suspicious of outsiders were more likely to survive and pass on their genes. And so that's why all humans have that tendency to have bias. It's left over like the appendix, just like that's why we say it's vestigial, just like the appendix. It's no longer useful. In fact, it's counterproductive today, but we're stuck with it just like we're stuck with our appendixes. However, note that we just have a tendency to have bias. What's not determined beforehand is who we identify as in our group, in-group, who we identify as in our out-group, and what stereotypes do we have about different outgroups. Those are developed and reproduced through politics and culture, okay? But so that's bias. Now, what is structural inequity? Structural inequity, again, we learned last, I think there was our first workshop, that are societal biases that have been intensified, codified, meaning put into law, and weaponized to protect the interests of usually dominant groups and elites. And you might recall this image. And so the waves on the bottom are individual biases, because all of us have individual bias. But if culture and politics weren't involved, then everybody would have different biases against different people. So it's really, the structural inequity is that tidal wave. The tidal wave we can think of as that prejudice plus power that's added to it. So laws or policies, right? And we can think of inequity. So we're going to break that down a little bit more. We're going to learn about exactly what that power is. How do we add power? What's exactly the difference between bias and equity? Let's look at that next. So we're going to build on that idea. So there we have our bias on the bottom, okay? And here we have our structural inequity on the top. That's the tidal wave, right? And in between, let's break down what that power means. I've also color coded it, you notice. So the bias is blue, but you notice the structural inequity is partly blue, but partly red. So the red is going to be the power. So that power, depending on the time and the place and the specific inequity, we're talking about a history of legal discriminatory policies with present day legacies. For example, with structural racism, we learned that those are primarily segregation and the wealth gap. Another element is disparities in economic outcomes across institutions that are unexplained by economic, cultural, or behavioral differences. And stereotypes that are interwoven through popular culture and political rhetoric, and also underrepresentation in power and influence and overall lower societal status. That is what we mean by power. And those are the elements that distinguish structural inequities, such as structural racism, from individual bias. You see the difference? Okay. I'm going to give you some examples, but I'll let this slide sit with you for a second. So remember, structural inequity is prejudice plus power, or bias plus power. Okay, so let's look at some examples. And so there we have our implicit bias training on the, so to address individual bias, then you would use implicit bias training. But notice that implicit bias training does nothing about those power elements in the middle. So some policies, for example, that would address inequity, those differences in power, here's some examples. So not requiring a college degree for a job position that doesn't actually require one. You'd be surprised at how many positions just automatically require a college degree when it doesn't even need one. That's an example of an exacerbation of inequity that implicit bias training would not address, right? Or ending legacy preferences for college admission. that addresses inequity, okay, in a way that implicit bias training doesn't. Ending exclusionary economic zoning. Remember, we learned about that last time, detached single family only zoning. Ending that. That would be another example of a policy that addresses inequity that bias training would do nothing about. And finally, providing all students with equal quality K through 12 education. Last time we learned that there's huge differences in the amount of school funding for Black, brown, and white students, high income and low income students. Supposedly everybody in the country has equal access to opportunity, but we definitely do not. And so all of those address inequity in a way that bias training does not. So teaching people, I promised to let you sit with slides for a minute, so hold on. Okay, so teaching people to be anti-racist doesn't necessarily address the structure of racism itself. One of our ongoing societal challenges will be figuring out ways to move beyond individual bias education to addressing the root causes of inequality and our role in upholding them. Or another way of saying this is improving intergroup relations versus creating more fair and just societies are not the same, not necessarily the same at least, right? Bias versus inequity. Okay, next we're going to do a how structure. We're going to look at 5 different examples of structural racism to see how structural racism manifests in different sectors. And just to give you a heads up, we're going to have a brain break right after the first one, number 1, and then we're going to have a second brain break after the 4th one. Okay, so let's look at the first example, how structural racism manifests in wealth accumulation. So here we have, you might recognize the green graph on the bottom. Remember, that's that wealth gap graph that we saw in our previous workshop. I've just shrunk it, okay? We're gonna see how structural racism, including the legacy of historical racism, affects that Black and white wealth gap, okay? So remember historical segregation. You might remember from last time that historical segregation has a huge impact on where you live, right? Because of redlining and housing, the FHA and VA discrimination, and how all the suburbs were white only. So historical segregation strongly influences where people live today. And we also learned that where one lives strongly influences where one goes to school, right? Because we have neighborhood public schools and school levels of school funding, and thus also quality of schools. Then we learned about the historical wealth gap and how that also influences where one lives, right? The amount of wealth a family has, which indirectly affects the quality of education, right? And also family wealth also directly affects the quality of K through 12 education through, for example, whether you can afford tutoring or other enrichment activities, or whether you don't have to have an after-school job, right? Or take care of your siblings. And the historical wealth and family wealth is also going to influence whether you can afford to go to college and what kind of college you go to. And it also affects your employment through, not necessarily through wealth, but also contacts. Like if your parents are wealthy, then personal contacts, as in addition to being able to afford an unpaid internship. And also the wealth gap, your family wealth is going to directly feed into your wealth through family inheritances or gifts, right? Or like, for instance, if the grandparents pay for the kids' preschool, for your kids' preschool, for example. And remember that wealth is partly income from your job and partly assets like stocks and bonds or inheritances, or home equity. Then there's often a racial aspect to access to banks, partly depending on where you live. And access to conventional credit will help determine where you get to live, what neighborhood you get to live in. and thus also your education, K through 12 education, and also whether you can afford to go to college and what kind of college you go to. And the quality of your K through 12 education is going to influence what kind your college education, and thus also the job you're going to get. And it also directly affects it, right? The quality, through the quality of your education. And of course, the money you get from your job is the other part of wealth, right? Because wealth is income from your job, plus those assets that you've inherited and gifts, inheritance that you've inherited from your family. So that is a very, very simplified skeleton illustration of structural racism. And I've left out a lot. For example, I've left out the role of racial bias. It didn't even mention that, right? We've only looked at so far at how historical racism affects Black people today. And I also didn't talk about racial bias in policing and criminal justice. That also plays a role. There would be arrows going all over the place from there too. And I didn't talk about racial disparities in health. So all those would have to be layered on to that very simple model. So this, folks, is structural racism. And you see that bias is exacerbating it, but actually, and on top of this, there's another layer we'll talk about at the end, which is individual opportunity hoarding. Okay, I'm not going to define that until we get to it at the end. But you notice that no individual race is required. Even if you got rid of racial bias 100%, this system would continue going. This would still affect people through that historical discrimination, historical racism that was never dismantled. The other thing you should notice is that, you always hear conservatives saying, well, you just have to work hard and you can get ahead, right? But you notice that pulling up your pants, scrupulous budgeting and saving, and getting a second or third job they're obviously necessary, but clearly not sufficient because of all these other structural factors, non-individual, the factors beyond the individual's control and rooted in our history. Okay, I told you there was going to be a 2-minute brain break, so we're going to do the same thing again. 30 seconds to rest your brain, and then 90 seconds for active processing. Okay, that was, you rested your brain. Now it's time to do some active processing in your notes to try to encourage comprehension and retention. Okay, it's time. So we're going to look at our next example, which is concentrated neighborhood poverty. So independent of your family or individual income or wealth, whether you live in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty versus, for example, a neighborhood of concentrated wealth or neutral, has a huge impact on your access to opportunity. Again, completely independent of your individual income or wealth. So here's an example of, this is in Washington, D.C. This is actually a GIS map created by my 11th and 12th graders back when I was teaching high school. So they created an access to opportunity index using all of these indicators, from most of them from the census. So access to health, access to employment, access to housing, access to public safety, and access to education. So they used that, it created one index using that indicators from, and they map that on the lower map, so the blue. So the areas with that are darker blue have more access to opportunity. You see, it's very geographically focused. Then on top of that, they layered on the Black population, which are those orange dots. So the bigger those orange dots, that's the larger the Black population in each census tract. So you can see that the Black population is concentrated in areas which have less access to opportunity. So again, supposedly we all have equal access to opportunity, but we can see that that is not true. It's very geographical based. And we learned last time that where people live is very tied to historical discrimination, such as redlining and the FHA mortgage discrimination. And that's what we mean. And in most Blacks especially low-income Blacks in Washington, D.C. live in areas of concentrated poverty. So that's what we mean by concentrated poverty, okay? So Ta-Nehisi Coates has a wonderful way of putting this. He says, whereas individual poverty deprives one of the ability to furnish one's basic needs, concentrated neighborhood poverty extends out from the wallet out to the surrounding institutions, the schools, the street, the community center, the policing. Okay, so let's look at structural racism. So we already saw that in last time, we saw how the historical redlining maps are very correlated with contemporary spatial patterns of family poverty, poor health, low home ownership rates, and concentrated poverty. So many of the areas that used to be redlined back in the 1930s are areas with concentrated poverty today. And we also saw that in addition to these historical roots, that present day policies exacerbate or reinforce or reproduce those patterns of concentrated poverty. Specifically, exclusionary zoning really increases concentrated poverty. So remember, exclusionary zoning is areas that have been zoned for detached single family homes only. So usually wealthier people who are often white. And that's been increasing notably since 2000. So all the areas in pink are all zoned for detached single family homes only. So that means low income people who are often in practice Black or Latinx get concentrated, get pushed into smaller and smaller poor areas, the areas of concentrated poverty, sort of like the old quote unquote ghettos back in the 1960s. We're going back to the high levels of concentrated poverty that we had back in the 1960s. And in fact, historians and sociologists and political science believe that that this rise in concentrated poverty, concentrated Black poverty since 2000 is exactly the reason why we see the rise in the Black Lives Matter movement and the rise in urban protests, for example, Ferguson, Minneapolis, Missouri. It's not a coincidence that those have been happening since 2000, around the same time. So the poor Blacks are almost 5 times as likely than poor whites to live in concentrated poverty. So that's concentrated poverty for this is defined as at least 20% of the census tract falls below the federal poverty line. So for example, about a quarter of poor Blacks live in concentrated poverty versus 5.5% of poor whites and almost 18% of poor Latinx. what was I going to say about that? I guess nothing. And also, non-poor Blacks are also much more likely to live in concentrated poverty than our non-poor whites. So here, this is defined a little bit differently. So you can't compare it with the other graph because this is by zip code instead of census tract. But very interesting. Around half of both non-poor Blacks and non-poor Hispanics live in concentrated poverty, non-poor, right? Compared to 17% of non-poor whites. Huge difference, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I got wrong. I was reading at the wrong graph. So it's 34% of non-poor Hispanics. I apologize.
Ayo, can you elaborate on what you mean by this? What does it mean for a non-poor Black, Hispanic, or white to live? Like, can you contextualize it a little bit?
Sure. So if we go back to here, this graph, we can see the areas in the poor neighborhoods. So here we can see in the southeast, the light blue areas, these are areas with concentrated poverty. Okay, so that means that most people in the area, at least 20, we know that at least 20% of the census tract, people in the census tract fall below the federal poverty line, right? So that's 20%. But what about the other 80%, right? So in practice, because of segregation, because of racial discrimination bias, and because of these historical patterns, was wealthier or middle-class Blacks are more likely to live in the areas with poor Blacks. They're not segregated, and they're less likely to be segregated out. So wealthy whites are more likely to live on their own in the wealthy neighborhoods, whereas middle-class and wealthy Blacks and also Latinx are more likely to be still living in those in areas with high levels of poverty. And what does that mean? That means less access to opportunity, because in low-income areas, there is less. We'll go down this list. There's fewer hospitals, right? There's fewer supermarkets. The school quality is much poorer. Of course, policing is more aggressive, et cetera. So middle-class whites are more likely to be able to live in the suburbs, to live in quote unquote nice areas, whereas middle-class Blacks and middle-class Latinos are more like, have a higher probability that they will live in a poor neighborhood, which means that they have less access to opportunity. Does that make it clearer?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for stopping me. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for clarifying. This is really interesting, and I hadn't seen this type of statistic before, so it begs a lot of questions about, like, sure, there's historical segregation, but then it occurs to me that there's agentic choice, like active choice by some groups to go to those places to infuse more economic power or whatever. So it's a very interesting concept. So thank you.
Yeah, there's also discrimination, racial. It's partly historical and partly because of discrimination. So Blacks and Latinx who try to get a house in a wealthier white neighborhoods will experience discrimination by real estate agents. It's not all, there's a lot of details that are not in here. I'm just adding them. And also studies have shown that middle class and upper middle class Blacks and Latinx will often choose to live in an area with other Blacks and Latinx out of comfort, that they don't want the stress and anxiety of racism in the white neighborhood. So sometimes it's a conscious choice. So it's a whole bunch of factors. Okay, and we'll see, as I earlier pointed out, the concentrated poverty has been increasing significantly since the Great Recession, since about 2000. So you can see that that's a big increase in just like 10 years, 10, 15 years. It's a significant increase. And again, historian and political scientists believe that this is a big explanation behind the rise in the Black Lives Matter movement, behind the rise in the urban protests, Ferguson, et cetera. They believe that this is a major factor behind it. And they also believe that the biggest factor behind the increase in concentrated poverty is the rise in that exclusionary zoning, which has gotten completely out of control. And this showing, this increase is overall. It's been, concentrated Black poverty has been increasing even greater in certain cities. So for example, these are cities that have experienced the highest increases in concentrated Black poverty. So again, this is only from 2000 to about 2010, 10 years, that's all. And look at this, Syracuse, 22% increase, Detroit, 40% increase. This is dramatically fast, rapid, huge, significant increases in concentrated Black poverty and in certain cities. Okay, next, our third example is HIV transmission. So this again is Washington, DC. So again, we back to that racial residential segregation. Because of residential segregation, then Blacks are more likely to live in the Southeast, where whites live in the Northwest. And you often hear, well, Blacks have higher rates of HIV because they engage in more risky sexual and drug activity. But that's not necessarily the case. A lot has to do with where you live, because where you live, this racial segregation leads to what they call dense sexual networks. Basically, it means, so in theory, you could have sex with anybody in the city who would have you, right? Hopefully you're single. But in practice, you only have sex with people who are in your same race or ethnicity and your same socioeconomic level, which means in your same neighborhood, because we're so racially segregated. And so your sexual pool or your sexual network is a very concentrated small area. That's what dense, what they mean it. So this leads to partner pools with high community viral loads for some people. And that leads to higher HIV rates. Because remember they said, oh, well, Blacks must have higher rates of risky activity. So let's say having unprotected sex. But notice that for having unprotected sex in this area with a very high high community HIV viral loads carries a much different risk and consequence to having unprotected sex in Ward 3. The very same individual behavior can have very, very different risks and consequences depending on where you live, which again is tied to race and socioeconomic class and our historical discrimination. And here's another example of how structural racism impacts HIV rates. So because we have incredibly high Black male incarceration rates in our country because of the war on drugs, so high that, look at this graph on the bottom, every dot is a census tract with 2,000 or more Black adults. That 100% is census tracts where there's equal numbers of Black women and Black men. But as you can see, most are below. And so down, this blue line would be 2 Black women for every Black male, because so many Black men are in jail. That's the ones way up on the top. And this has huge consequences. So they call this a low sex ratio. So low sex ratios in many Black neighborhoods lead to lower marriage rates because there's no one for Black women to get married to. And it leads to higher single parenting rates. And it also leads to unequal gender power relations, because it's going to be very hard for you to pressure your partner to be sexually faithful to you and to use a condom if there's 2 or 3 other Black women waiting in line for that man. So for example, this is Atlanta. In the Peach areas, there are 2 Black women for every Black male. And not surprisingly, that's where we have higher HIV rates. Okay, our next example is with employment. And after this, we're going to have a brain break. So after, during the 1970s, our country deindustrialized. So at that time, there was lots of factory jobs, but all the factory jobs are gone mostly. And they were either mechanized or automated, or they were sent offshore to other countries. And that leads to our economy has now, what economists say, has a job polarization or an hourglass economy. Okay, so here we have a change in share of US employment from 1980 to 2016 by occupational skill level. So over here we have the low skill jobs. So basically the McDonald's jobs, right? So you don't need any skills, but you need 2 or 3 of these jobs to pay your bills. And these are jobs that have 0 benefits, right? No health insurance or retirement. And you notice there's growth in that. And over here on the other end is high skill jobs. These are great. You only need 1 and it has benefits, but you need a college degree for this one. In between, these are what they call the middle skill jobs. These were the old factory jobs. You did not need a college degree, but you could, you only needed 1 and it had benefits. And if you worked hard for many years and saved, you could buy a house and do pretty well for yourself, be a part of the middle class. You notice those jobs are gone. You see that there's negative growth in those jobs. So this is why economists refer to the hourglass economy, or they refer to job polarization, right? The 2 ends. Now, of course, this problem affects everybody, but we're going to see that it disproportionately affects Blacks and Latinx because we are less likely to have that college degree. And because of geography, as we're going to see in the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to see how that this problem is exacerbated by geography. And economists refers to this as spatial mismatch, meaning like geographic mismatch. So a mismatch between where low-income residents live and where the low-skilled jobs are located. Notice they don't even mention the middle-skilled jobs because there are no middle-skilled jobs. So now we're even fighting over the low-skilled jobs. We're talking about cashiers, the people working at the mall, the servers at Olive Garden, etc. So this is a map of Dallas. The orange mess is the public transportation system. The darker blue areas are where Black people are concentrated. The spidery black dots are where low-income housing is located. Now we're going to superimpose on that the growth in low job skills, okay? Now, the yellow dots. Notice that the yellow dots are not in the cities. They're in the suburbs. And we know from both probably a personal experience and also from our last workshop, because of history, we know because of our history of our country, because all the suburbs were white only, remember, we know that Blacks and Latinx are concentrated in the cities. And that's where most low-income people are located. And we can see because of the black dots. Remember, the black dots are where low-income people are. So we can see that these yellow dots, the jobs, are not necessarily located next to the public transportation and are not necessarily located in the areas where there's lots of Black people and are not necessarily located near the low-income housing. They're located in the suburbs because think, where are the malls? Where are the Olive Gardens? They're in the suburbs for 2 reasons. First of all, because real estate is cheaper in the suburbs than in the cities, and also because that's where the consumers live. So low-income jobs are service jobs. To provide a service, you need to be next to the consumer, and the consumers, middle-class consumers, live in the suburbs. So that is why you will find, so economists find the most fascinating thing is when they'll look at the job boards for a certain metropolitan area or a city, they will find in the same city, tons of people looking for a job and can't find one. At the same time, same place, you find tons of employers that are looking for employees and can't find any in the same city because the low-income workers cannot get to the low-income, the low-skilled jobs because of lack of transportation. This is what they call spatial mismatch. And of course, this is going to affect all low-income people, but we know that because of the racial wealth gap and because of racial segregation, it's going to disproportionately affect Blacks. Now, this is just Dallas, but we can see the same in many, especially the older core cities like Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. These are cities where that had depended on a lot of factory jobs that are gone. So you can see that there's negative growth in the city, the green. And you can see all the job growth is in the orange suburbs and the beige outer suburbs. But of course, low-income people live in the cities mostly, at least in these areas. Okay, we're gonna do another 2-minute brain break, and then we'll do education. Okay, you should be working on your notes now. Okay, it's time. We're gonna do education now. So with education, it's a matter of how do we count the many ways that structural racism affects education? And by the way, you should be taking extra careful notes because I know that Cynthia is going to focus the post presentation discussion on how structural racism affects education and specifically UC Merced. Okay, I've organized it by, you recall this image from last time. This is the 3 major present day legacies of historical discrimination: racial bias and stereotypes, the racial wealth gap, and residential segregation. So first we're gonna look at K through 12 education and then college admissions. So, and I've also color coded them green, red, and blue. So the racial wealth gap is going to mean you are more likely to have after school job or family responsibilities that take away from the time and effort you can spend on your studies, less access to tutoring and educational enrichment, even for example, traveling. And then bias, there's the stress of routinely experiencing microaggressions and racism. And sorry, more tech issues. Racial bias in grading, discipline, and gifted programs. We're going to look at some studies about that. And then, as we saw, there's disparities in school funding and quality because of we have neighborhood schools, and so that comes we'll see that later. And then low-income schools are less likely to have access to 8th grade algebra, and in high school, access to AP and the International Baccalaureate. And then with college admissions, and again, there's my tech. Oh, there we go. With college admissions, with the racial wealth gap, you are less likely to be able to afford tuition. And SAT and ACT scores, turns out, are strongly correlated with income. So they partly illustrate how much you know, and partly illustrate they're just an indicator of your family wealth. And come on, you're less likely to qualify for preferential admissions like affirmative action. And I know that sounds controversial, but I'm going to show you that there's actually more preferential admissions for wealthy white students than for low-income Black and Latinx students. There's actually a college preference for full-paying students who are often wealthy and white. And there's less access to, a low-income school is going to have less access to college counselors. And also the college is less familiar with low-income high schools usually, and they do less reach out to them. So we're going to see some, this is sort of an overview. I'm going to show you some graphs and studies that illustrate some of these points, okay? Okay, so as we saw before, there's huge disparities in school funding. Non-white school districts receive $23 billion total less than white districts, despite serving the same number of students. For every student enrolled, the average non-white school district receives $2,226 per student less than a white school district. You might recall these, and that is because about almost 50% of school funding comes from local property taxes. So that means if the families in the neighborhood are wealthy and can afford to buy nice houses, then those schools are going to have a lot more funding than schools in neighborhoods where the families don't have a lot of wealth. And of course, students are required to go to their neighborhood schools. So in other countries, education is the engine of mobility, right? If you go to school and work hard, you can get ahead. In the United States, because of these differences in funding that are tied to family wealth, education tends to reinforce economic and racial inequity instead of helping people get ahead. We already saw that, but here's some studies that show evidence of bias. So a 2016 Yale Child Study Program found that Black boys are more likely to be disciplined for challenging behavior, even when they act the same as others. So, and this may help explain the high preschool expulsion rates for Black boys. Imagine getting expelled from preschool. So in this study, they showed teachers a video of 4 preschool kids, 1 Black girl, 1 Black boy, 1 white girl, and 1 white boy playing together around a table. There was 0 bad behavior. They told the teachers, watch out for challenging behavior. And then they tracked the teachers' eyes. 42% of the time, the teachers' eyes were tracking Black boys. 34% of the time, they were tracking white boys. In other words, they also had a gender bias. And surprise, surprise, they found challenging misbehavior by the Black boys that did not exist. A 2015 Stanford study found that teachers were more likely to view fictitious students with Black sounding names as disruptive, were more likely to see their second infractions as part of a pattern, and were more likely to recommend them for disciplinary action. So the teachers were shown written vignettes of student misbehavior that were identical, except that half had Black sounding names and half had white sounding names. There was no difference in race in the first infraction, but there was a significant difference in the teachers' responses to the second infraction. So again, if they perceived the fictitious student as being Black, they were after the second, they were more likely to see the second infraction as part of a pattern and recommend them for disciplinary action. There's also racial bias in grading. In a 2020 USC study, teachers, particularly white women, were 4.7 percentage points more likely to consider the quote unquote white child's writing at above or at or above grade level compared to the identical writing from a quote unquote Black child. So again, they had the identical handwriting. It's a fake handwriting piece, but on the left, they have written in Deshawn and Aaron. And on the right, they have substituted Connor and Scott to indicate Black and white child. 30% of the teachers thought that this quote unquote Black child's writing was grade level or above. 35% of the teachers thought the quote unquote white child's writing was grade level or above. A study found that Black students were less likely to be identified as gifted even with qualifying IQ test scores. So this was an unnamed school district in Florida. So in 2004 and 2005, the purple, the school was still using their traditional way of identifying gifted students. And that is that students that were flagged as potentially gifted by either the teacher or the parent were sent to the school district psychologist who administered formal long testing, IQ testing. And if they got 130 or above, they got placed in the IQ program. In 2006 and 2007, the light blue, the school district got funding to do universal testing, which meant that everybody in the classroom sat down and did a very simplified informal IQ test. And if they got above a certain point on that, they got sent to that same school district psychologist who did the same formal IQ testing. And then if they got higher than 130, they got into the IQ, into the gifted program. Lo and behold, when they did the universal testing, the numbers of gifted students jumped for Black, Latinx, English language learners, low income students, and even females. The sad part is that they lost the funding and they switched back to the old teacher and parent referral, and the numbers went right back. Two studies have identified significant and growing grade inflation over the last 20 years, but notably more in affluent, wealthy, and private schools. So you can see between 1998 and 2016, grade point averages have increased significantly, but the SAT score did not. In fact, SAT scores dropped at the same time that GPAs increased. So that indicates grade inflation. And this was both across private versus public, and also wealthier schools versus low income schools. The researchers suggested that wealthier parents have more time and more confidence to be pushy and to challenge teachers. College tuition has soared while state funding has dropped significantly. A college degree is increasingly essential for economic progress, yet increasingly out of financial reach for students from low-income families. And because of this, it appears that informally, in order to pay these tuitions, colleges are informally giving preference to wealthy students. So this is from Paul Tufts' book, The Inequality Machine, How College Divides Us. He wrote, there is a popular and persistent image of college admissions in which diversity-obsessed universities are using affirmative action to deny spaces to academically talented, affluent students while admitting low-income students with lower ability in their place. Balkenstock, I don't know how to pronounce his name, head of enrollment at DePaul and then Oregon State, says that the opposite is closer to the truth. If you're an enrollment manager, he explains, the easiest category of students for you to admit are below average students from high income families. Because their parents can afford tutoring, they're very likely to have decent SAT and ACT scores, which means they won't hurt your US news ranking. They probably won't distinguish themselves academically at your college, but they can pay full tuition. And affirmative action, there's this myth of affirmative action, but even with affirmative action, Blacks and Hispanics are more underrepresented at top colleges than 35 years ago. So this is from 1982 to 2017. You can see a significant drop and these are at top colleges. And that is partly because racial quotas and granting points in admissions was ruled unconstitutional back in 1978. Schools can now only consider race as a factor of a factor of a factor, as one of many factors of a student's lived experience. For example, leadership experience as the president of a Black students union, or an essay on the importance of the Korean church community. And of course, in California, you guys have forgotten which law that is, but it's even worse. And of course, because of the rising tuition, as we saw, colleges are favoring wealthier students. And more wealthy white students than Black students actually benefit from explicitly preferential admissions, like affirmative action. So I created this graph using data from the economic study that was Exhibit A in the federal court case, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. You might recall that that basically these racist whites were trying to attack affirmative action using Asians. They were saying that Asian Americans were less likely were being crowded out by affirmative action to Blacks and Latinos. So this is they forced Harvard to turn over all their enrollment data, their private admissions data, the admissions data for 2014 to 2019. This is unheard of to have access to this internal data. But it's fascinating what the economists found, and these were the economists for the people who were against affirmative action. So they found of the students who were admitted to Harvard over this 5-year period, 2,179 of the students, 43% of the white students were admitted under preferential admissions. These preferential admissions include to athletes, and we're not talking about football and basketball players here or baseball. We're talking about fencing and squash, so mostly wealthy white. So of athletes who applied, 86% were admitted. Of legacy students that applied, meaning their parents went to the school, 34% were admitted. Of kids who applied off of the dean's interest list, we're talking mostly the families are donors to the university, 42% were admitted. Children of faculty, 47% were admitted. 74 of these percent were whites. African Americans who were applied, 7.5% were admitted. And all these preferential admissions are very open and explicit preferential admissions. It's like plus points, very, very explicit. It's legal, it's completely constitutional as long as it's not by race. And most of these preferential admissions go to wealthy white students. So let's go back to the graph. Let's look at the second column. So the second column is a subset of the first column. So of this 2,179 students who were whites who were admitted under preferential admissions, this is how many who were unqualified, meaning that they did not meet Harvard admissions officers' own internal minimal requirements. Like they add up a whole bunch of points and usually below a certain point get thrown out. These ones were considered unqualified, but were admitted anyhow because of these preferential admissions. And these were 16% of total admissions. The last column, they were unable to identify Black students who may have benefited from affirmative action because affirmative action is illegal. It has been unconstitutional for a long time. It only exists in white parents' heads. So remember, it's only a factor of a factor of a factor. So even these economists working with admissions officers were unable to identify how many, if any, of the Blacks had benefited from quote unquote affirmative action. So they were forced to put down every single Black student who applied. So in other words, you are more likely to meet an unqualified white admit than an unqualified Black or Latino. And if Asian students are being crowded out, they're being crowded out not by affirmative action for Blacks and Latinos, but rather by unqualified wealthy white students. In other words, we can see here, this is
I don't want to interrupt, but there was just like a quick clarification in the chat that on the 86% of the athletes means absolutely no football players, or it includes all.
No,
sports.
it's everyone. But I'm saying, usually when you say athletes, you immediately think that most of them are, yeah, it includes everyone, but it's much more, you're much more likely to get into Harvard from playing squash or, it's most like, for instance, I'm trying to remember the exact number, but they did it was also an internal study of athletes at Harvard. And I think over half came from families with more than 500,000 who made over $500,000 a year, just for an example. They're much more likely to be wealthy white rather than, there's a few, I'm sure there's a few low income and Black and Latinos in there, but it's majority wealthy white. Is that better? Okay, so this is National Department of Education data. Okay, and on the left are kids from the poorest 20% of the population. Sorry, 25%. And on the three columns are low test scores, middle test scores, and high test scores. These are test scores, are 8th grade scores on standardized assessments of math. And on the right are kids from the wealthiest 25% of the population. And again, low test scores, middle test scores, and high test scores. The y-axis is measuring college graduation rate. What percent graduated from college? And it turns out that wealthy students with low test scores are actually slightly more likely to graduate from college than poor students with high test scores. In other words, socioeconomic class is more important to college graduation than academic achievement. And finally, wealthy white students are much more likely to attend a highly selective institution. So here we have the percent of students attending highly selective institutions by race within income quintile. So this is the bottom 20th% next, and then up to the right is the highest, the wealthiest, and then Black, Hispanic, and white. And you can see that wealthy whites have a much higher chance of going to college and have a much higher chance of going to a highly selective institution.
Well, there's a question in the chat asking what are highly selective institutions?
I have to go back and see which one, but basically Ivy League and also Stanford and those top colleges. I can't remember how it's exactly defined, but the top one, the top colleges in the country. Is that specific enough? During the discussion, I can look up to see exactly, but the ones that are hardest to get into. I'm guessing it includes Berkeley and Stanford and California and the Ivy Leagues and, what's it called? University of Michigan, etc.
Yeah, they thanked you. Thank you.
Okay. And then I squeezed in, I told you it was 5 examples. I didn't tell you about this. This is not exactly an example, but I want to tell you about HBO's The Wire. So up until now, you've noticed that we've seen structural racism in different sectors, right? Health, education, et cetera, et cetera. Remember in the beginning, I told you that racism is not just only structural, meaning not just individual, right? Policies and practice and culture, the groundwater, but also it's systemic, meaning that structural racism in, for example, housing affects education, which, the gears, remember this. So I'm going to show I wonder if you've ever seen the HBO show The Wire, but it's actually a great example of this. It illustrates how the different sectors affect each other. So especially the difference, you notice the different seasons go into these different gears, right? Education, politics, economics, criminal justice system, policing, the media. These are the different gears, and we can really see how they layer on each other and exacerbate each other and affect each other. The decline of urban labor markets, crime and incarceration, the war on drugs, educational inequities, and ineffective city governments reinforce each other to produce profound disadvantages for the urban poor, particularly African Americans, that shape and constrain their individual choices and behavior. These systemic disadvantages become more deeply entrenched over time and over generations. And you also notice that they're specific to place, geography, Baltimore specifically. We've talked a lot about that. And we also see that low-income whites also experience structural poverty, especially in season 2 on the docks, while low-income Blacks experience both structural poverty and structural racism. This is an example of intersectionality. And The Wire also shows how individuals with privilege reinforce structural racism to maximize self-interest within the constraints of these institutions, oftentimes, rather than because they're explicitly bad or racist. Doesn't mean that they aren't also racist, but there's plenty of other people who are, contribute to the system without really thinking consciously of it. And because of all of that, Black income mobility, it's even lower than white income mobility. Actually, let's see this one first. So let's look up income mobility. Income mobility is the probability of you making it from rags to riches, the American dream, the possibility of being born to a low-income family, but rising to a higher economic level. So that's what we call the American dream. And supposedly, we have the highest levels of income mobility. Supposedly we have the American dream, right? That's the myth, but the myth is very, very different from reality. So this graph is comparing economic mobility in the United States with the other Western wealthy countries in the world. And we actually have the lowest levels of income mobility in all of these countries. So the green dot is, oh, by the way, they're looking only at fathers and sons, and that is because they don't want the gender pay gap to mess up, right? Mess up the comparison. So they're looking at only fathers and sons so that they can control for the gender pay gap. So the green dot is the percent of low-earning fathers who are in the richest 25% of the population. In other words, the rags to riches story, right? You went from poor to rich. We have the lowest levels in the entire developed countries. The yellow dot is the opposite. It's the percent of top earning fathers who are, it's the percent of sons with top earning fathers who are in the richest 25% of the population, meaning they were born wealthy and they are still wealthy. And that's next to the highest in the country. So levels of income mobility of that rags to riches American dream are the lowest in the United States than anywhere else, but it's even worse for Blacks. So this is a study by Raj Chetty in Harvard, and he separated out white upward mobility from Black upward mobility. So he defined this as percent of poor kids who become rich adults. Specifically, it's the rate of kids with parents in the poorest 20% of Americans who as adults make it to the wealthiest 20% of adults and of Americans. And when we say wealthiest 20%, yes, that of course includes Oprah, but it also in the top 20% includes firemen and teachers. So that's pretty wide. It's not necessarily, you don't necessarily make it to Oprah. It just means out of poverty. And that's 11% for whites, which is already too low, but it's 3% for Blacks. So for a low-income Black to make it out of poverty, they really have to beat the odds. They're really statistical outliers. They really made it despite our system and not because of our system, because of all of what we have learned today. Okay, and so we have finished. I'm just gonna give, let's see, we're gonna go ahead and give some ending thoughts. 3 ending thoughts. One is that structural racism and racial inequity harm us all. So remember, in the very beginning, I told you that Citibank is one of the many economic institutions that recognizes structural racism. Their study found that racial inequality cost the economy $16 trillion over the last 20 years, mostly because of lost opportunity. You know, like they say, what is it? The brain is a horrible thing to waste. A mind is a horrible thing to waste. It's basically that. It's all that lost opportunity. If the United States was a corporation, they would get fired for such inefficient use of resources, right? Because if you're low income, even though you're smart, even though you're working hard and want to get ahead, it's very hard to do so. And also, this is from the book, Heather McGhee's, the book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. She also notices, she also makes the point that structural racism and racial inequity divide us all. Since this country's founding, we have not allowed our diversity to be our superpower. And the result is that the United States is not more than the sum of its disparate parts. But it could be. And if it were, all of us would prosper. In short, we must emerge from this crisis in our republic. She was writing this in 2021, so that's why she says crisis, with a new birth of freedom, rooted in the knowledge that we are so much more when the we in we the people is not some of us, but all of us. We are greater than and greater for the sum of us. And last, this is from the last 3 paragraphs in an article called "The Pandemic is a Portal" by Indian author Arundhati Roy. This was at the very beginning of the pandemic in April 2020. The article is about India, the pandemic in India, but the last 3 paragraphs are stunning. She wrote, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." Okay, so again, we're going to have the 2-minute brain break. And then I'm just giving you a heads up that after the 2-minute brain break, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask everybody to share their thoughts or takeaways in the chat. We would like 100% participation. And after that, we'll open it up to verbal discussion. Okay, but first we'll have our 2-minute brain break. Okay, I'd like you to want to gather your thoughts and think about what you're going to write in the chat to share with everybody. Okay, it's time. So I would like everybody to put something into the chat. And then we'll have our discussion based on around why we, how it's important to understand how that box works, especially in education, how it produces this black box of structural racism, produces these disparities in education, especially in education, college admissions, and university retention, specifically at UC Merced. Okay, would like everybody like to share their thoughts in the chat. Okay, is that everybody? Wendy and Cynthia, do you have a sense of whether everybody participated or not? And I don't know if people are still typing.
I definitely want to encourage, if you haven't had the opportunity to share your thoughts, please do so. Because as we all read them, it's important to understand where our collective consciousness is going. And I can definitely report back, Ayo, that there's substantial movement in the chat, and it's
Okay,
quite
great. So
encouraging.
it's okay if we just wait a little longer?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
Maybe like a minute or two, but the
Yep.
movement is happening, and I'm just trying to make sure I stay caught up.
Perfect. And I'm reading too. It's give me a chance to finish reading. Okay, so let's go. I want to, before we open up, I hope it's okay. I wanted to respond to a couple of the specific questions in the chat that I saw. One was that Mariana Abuan, I don't know how you pronounce your name, but I would love to hear about the connections to sci-fi, cyber, something I can't read my notes, and Frankenstein. If you could email me, I would love that. And thanks for the references to Tubac Roses and Concrete and Dan Price Seattle. I noted those down. Thank you. A couple of questions. So there was one about is it possible to get rid of structural racism without getting rid of structural poverty? No, big fat no. That's why I call them the two big evils. Remember those overlapping circles? They're very closely intertwined and interwoven. Any solutions that we have will have to address both structural racism and structural poverty. The second question is the question about SAT and tracking SATs, like if they didn't make the SAT required. So I don't know what would happen if universally everybody didn't make SAT required, but that same book, what was it, Paul Tufts' book, of course that was in the early, it was a year or two ago, so it was in the early days when only a few schools were getting rid of the SAT. They did ask the participants, the what do you call it? The people who were looking for admissions. They asked them afterwards to submit their SAT score so that they could study it. And they also tracked them, and they found that yes, their SAT scores were lower. However, that they did just as well as the kids that were with the higher GPA. They found that their graduation rate and their GPA for the freshman year was identical, or was lower by like a 0.01% or something like that. It wasn't a significant difference. And that is because GPA is actually a much better predictor of academic promise and probable academic performance than is the what's called the SAT score. So the SAT score in large part is a reflection of family wealth. It is so much a reflection of family wealth that it's not as strong a predictor of academic promise than GPA. The other thing, because the SAT reflects, for instance, your exposure to travel and et cetera, and also test prep, right? Whereas the GPA is testing your grit, it's your hustle, it's how hard you're working, and that is why. So even kids that have high SAT scores, if they come to college and don't work, they sit on their butts, they're not gonna perform very well. That's part of the reason why. And then the third question was about taking several generations to get over the wealth gap. I can't remember who asked that question, but you might recall I don't know if you were here last time and saw that wealth gap. The wealth gap is increasing rather than decreasing. So there's some economic studies that say, well, if in theory you got rid of all bias, then eventually maybe then the racial wealth gap would start decreasing. There's other people that say, no, it will never decrease. It will continue increasing, even if you, in theory, got rid of all bias, because wealth begets wealth. And because, our economy rewards inequality. And so there are many financial people who will argue that unless you had significant government intervention, that racial wealth gap is going to continue to grow exponentially over time. Okay, so let's open it up for discussion. So Cynthia, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Io. Can we go back to the prior image real quick? So I wanted to open it up here with this particular black box image, because a lot of the things that we talk about, not only within the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, but when we are within different work groups or committees, we talk about what do we need to do to increase our diversity of faculty and staff? Let's look at our hiring practices. What do we need to do to retain said faculty, staff, and students? Let's look at our campus climate. Let's look at just the way we're getting that feedback from our community and applying it into decision-making. Well, let's look at the different roles all of our units play in promoting our institutional culture and identity. But then we also look at, well, what's happening in the city of Merced County, Central Valley, and that political identity and conversation that also influences how we show up at work, the biases we have. And I was listening to reading a book where the term used by the author is not implicit bias or unexamined bias, but unchecked. Because to know that we have these biases, we're not checking them and understanding how they fuel inequities, how they promote these practices that are exclusive to already underprivileged communities. So as we try to link it together, we know what these impacts and outcomes are. We know what our roles, titles, and duties are. We know what our offices are. And I'll monitor the chat too. Oh, please take that one if you know how to unpack that. But the link here is, how do we get from this structural racism, and as Wendy dropped in the chat, these cogs, they're all, whether it's educational sector, economics, wealth, and our neighborhood segregation, when we look at all of these pieces moving together, we know that one person, if you remove the races, it'll still work correctly. So do we understand how structural racism, one, what does it look like in the higher ed context? Two, what does it look like at UC Merced? I would argue we know what it feels like. We know what it looks like. We know the practices and behaviors. But how do we start building those linkages that we know structural racism is contingent on the interconnectedness? And if we're vested in making sure that we can dismantle and redefine it, that also comes with our own interconnectedness with one another. So if I even look at the audience here today, we have folks representing faculty. We have folks representing staff. We have folks representing a lot of our operative arms of the university. We have folks that are directly serving students. We have folks that focus on research. We have folks that think about our business processes. But all together, when we're talking about structural racism as it shows up within our campus community, it does merit, how does it show up in my area? How do I build the relationships that help me tackle it? Do I even have the energy to do that? Because it's daunting practice. So the reason why it's so critical to start naming and describing with rich description, what exactly does it look like here at UC Merced, is because we are here at UC Merced. And we can look at other institutions and the way they've done it, but we also have to be richly able to describe it here. So I have a couple of notes before getting your thoughts on some of the processing I did. So if we're looking at systemic changes, we're looking at relationship to build the bridges. And that means building the bridge halfway. If I'm an advocate for equity and justice, how do I build the relationship and the bridge halfway to a colleague on campus, to another campus office and unit, if we're saying we are both vested in this equity and justice work? We can reflect on, okay, well, one dimension is our underrepresented student body. When they get here, given everything Ayo's laid out, right? What are we doing to retain them, right? We think about student debt if they're already coming from that wealth gap. We think about high impact practices, how we provide it to not only some of our students, but to the majority of students, right? That can be study abroad, that can be paid internships. There's so many different that the literature speaks to that. How do we promote career network building, right? Our roles in academic, professional, and identity development to make sense of, wow, I live in a society that because of these identities and these intersecting layers, I'm already put at a substantial disadvantage, but how do I do the work, right? The pride building, the connection, the affirmations, the healing that comes with navigation. I think about our URM faculty and staff that need the psychological and physical safety to honor our university's mission, right? That comes with affinity groups, that connections that really support this idea of, yes, you're valuable, you're brilliant, you're important, right? We can look at tenure processes. We can look at the way we support our Unit 18 lectures. We can think about how diversity shows up in our hiring practices and even professional development opportunities, and not assume that everyone had access to the same opportunities that we do. At our university, we think about our economic context, right? The funding support, the philanthropic partners that are critical given our unique situation, which impacts capacity, our ability to recruit and staff our offices and units and expand our services to develop and deliver programs. It talks about our infrastructure. And the other bucket I thought about was campus climate and culture, right? The unchecked biases and prejudices that undermine professional development opportunity, right? Those feelings of being valued and included that really support, yes, I belong here and they want me here. These can be our traditions, these can be the celebrations or act of appreciation, whether that's in paid labor or other forms, right? But the tricky piece is, I also mentioned this other part, right? This individual skill and support and the hard work that comes involved in it. So it makes it extremely thorny, the conversation we're in, right? Not only as an Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, but as an institution trying to attain inclusive excellence. So with that, the important piece of Ayo's seminars is how do we individually, we have a natural connection to certain parts of those modules. There are certain things that deeply resonate with us, but how do we start taking the things that capture our attention and thought and start thinking, well, how do I apply this as a insert title, insert duty, insert role? How do I take this knowledge that I'm now acquiring and putting it into practice? So that's my invitation to everyone here. How do we do that? What questions can we raise, or what is it that we need to really understand the black box? Have we named it sufficiently so that we know when we talk about policies, practices, and procedures, we know exactly what we're talking about? Or we can't quite name it yet. Perhaps we start there. Or we start with the outcomes we want to see. How do we support sense of belonging and create the programming, events, and initiatives to get us there? So that's my invitation. Where do we start here at UC Merced to start linking the impact of structural racism and its historical legacy with the work we're confronted in today in 2021? And feel free to raise your hand, drop it in the chat, but I hope I don't get to talk to myself. Go for it, Michelle.
Yeah, hi. I'm not really sure I'm addressing it, but I mean, one thing that, I think the luxury of being a lecturer with the merit writing program is that when we're teaching like reading and writing skills and research skills, we have a theme that we can choose to, get those tools going for students. So that's one strategy. So that's one thing that we get to do. And I think Mariana kind of alluded to it too. So I know that's one thing that Mariana also does, that we tend to do that. So for instance, I'm using intersectional theory in my writing one classes and introducing students to that to bring that in. I'm sure others could talk to and can speak to this too. So that's one thing. I'm done. Thank you.
No, I love it, because part of the work I like to do is mapping out how each of us are already practicing it in some shape or form. Yeah, go for it. I see Mariana.
Hi, can you hear me? I think you can hear me.
Sure can.
One of the things that the merit writing program recently did was add we've nicknamed it the diversity CLO to our writing 1 and writing 10 courses. And I'm sorry, it was my idea, okay? And it's awesome. I would love to see diversity or EDI as a WASC outcome. It's not up there, it should be one. And so we're hoping that will encourage other instructors to realize like, hey, this is something I need to figure out an approach to this in my classroom, whatever angle that may be, because we've seen from today, like there are hundreds of ways to go about this. Like it's easy to cover if you just look for it. And, but it is interesting how this has been threatening to some of our instructors. And so now the follow-up to this has been like, okay, so we're not saying you've done anything wrong because you didn't think of this before, but maybe you're doing it now. And so we're trying to build a lot of infrastructure to help instructors see like, this is how you can do it here. This is how you can do it here. This is, so that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that, because that's another way we influence our structure. So we're saying within merit writing program, we have our SLO around diversity. I want to see it in the WASC. What do we need to do to start putting the momentum in that area? Because to do that is a policy change. And then the system starts to operate radically different. But we need to hear this from each other, or else we don't realize how much momentum we actually have across the university. So thank you for sharing. This is another important conversation. So I'm gonna read what Molly's dropped in the chat. It says, what do we know from people, students, faculty, or staff who left? What can we learn about reasons for their struggles? What past or current practices and cultures are most harmful, right? Where do we begin to tackle this, right? Because there's things that we've seen and observed and heard maybe through the grapevine in your own networks as to why people are leaving. Microaggressions, racial hostility, lack of professional development opportunity, lack of a sense of belonging, like I feel excluded, right? And these are all factors that impact our ability to find joy and thriving in the workplace. But all of this shows up a lot of this shows up in our staff surveys, in our institutional climate surveys, right? But we feel and recognize anecdotally and in our observations, it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, community, it may have gotten a little bit more exacerbated with the pandemic, right? What are those reasons for their struggles? A lot of it is connected to structural racism and the impact as to why we say we need to be psychologically and physically safe. We need access to professional development opportunity. We need transparency for the tenure process. We want professional development to be able to move up the career ladder. But what are the answers to how we get that done? Our current practices, we can look at different departments and units to help us understand. But the other lens I want to bring into here is that even in the process of learning how different units and offices are set up, sometimes we're not ready to hear, oh, wow, I never thought about it from that perspective, which is the bridge building analogy I want to bring here. Bridging halfway through is that creation point in the middle, but it's difficult because we're exhausted. So who here might have a tackle to that? What past or current practices are most harmful? Where do they live in our university black box? Can we name them? And do we know the policy that supports them, or we don't know quite yet how to change them? What's the lever? Yep, go for it, Michelle.
One thing that always stands out for me is I always try to encourage students. For students, I'd say that, I mean, treat them like when students have been in a class and they leave, I always tell them, I always want to start this thing where I want them to come back and be mentors to the next group of students. And because they don't have to be the top 5 or 10% of the class or something like that. It doesn't have to be like that. I think that's so important and gives them, and they get really excited when I talk to them about that. And I say, I'd really like to get something like that going. You know, what do you think of that? I mean, I don't know what the, I need to get more, faculty involved in this idea, but Mariana, you want to jump in on this one either also, or no? I think there's other things on campus that have something. I mean, I would love to talk to a larger network is what I'm trying. I would like to network with people. I know there are some people on campus that are doing things like this, and I would really like to get some big momentum going where students come back in, former students come back in and just drop in once in a while if they have a spare moment, or, and what can they get from that though? I mean, there's always got to be some kind of a return thing. So I don't know, what would that look like? Anyhow, just a big thought. Just want to throw it out there.
A great thought. Question to the community. Does our culture support relationship and partnership cultivation? Melissa.
Hello, my name is Melissa. I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm a new postdoc in the School of Natural Sciences here, and
Welcome.
I thank you. I love the idea of asking students to come back and be mentors, because I think as someone who has struggled with my identity as a scientist and with my confidence, telling a student, I trust you to mentor this next group would go a long way towards making them feel like I belong and my skills have value and I can pass that on to someone else, and it might make them feel like more of the community. And, I think people thrive when you say, I trust you to have this responsibility because I believe in you. Yeah, I work with graduate students in my lab. I work with Michael Dawson, and it's always great when I can teach them something and I can see them teach it to the new person coming in, and it also kind of instills this lab culture of camaraderie, and we're all in this together and we help. And yeah, so those are some of my minor thoughts on it.
I wrote down, I trust you to have this responsibility. It's deeply connected with our culture.
Thank you, Melissa, by the way. She said it so much better than I did. So that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Love it.
Could I share from the research? Do you mind? Or
Go
is
for it, Io. Yes.
Okay. There was a study done of over 800 businesses and corporations. I'm not sure if they were high. It's a little bit different than students, but I don't know if they could apply. And they found that in order to increase rates of promotion, for example, and hiring among women and minorities, they found that implicit bias training did the worst out of it. And some of the policies that they found that were most successful, and they were looking over, again, 800 firms over 4 or 5 years. And one of them was mentoring, not by same identity, but across identity. So the most powerful, most privileged people at the firm, usually wealthy whites. So they paired them with a mentee who didn't have privilege, a woman or a person of color or both. And they found that those powerful men availed all of their resources and contacts and privilege to that person. And it basically, because that person, employee, became a reflection of them, became like their family. And those mentees took off and did extremely well. It was one of the most successful at helping them. Of course, those people also needed a second mentor, like the one that I've forgotten who was the person describing. So they needed like 2 different mentees, one to help them out with how it is to be, for instance, a woman in the science field or something like that. But another one to help them with sharp elbows and contacts to help them get ahead. Just wanted to point that out.
Appreciate that, Io.
Cynthia, really quick, I just want to acknowledge Shara's comments in the chat.
Yeah,
I don't know if you had a chance to see them or not.
Yeah, I sure did. I wrote the comment around, we're having a lot of conversations of new systems and creating spaces for dignity, right? Shara, if you would want to elaborate, you can elect not to, but what type of elements need to go into this? How do we describe it so that we don't get it wrong?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. But something that I do know is that I observed a great amount of dignity to it as far as ability, people's physical bodily autonomy, and to our caregivers, to our women, to our women of color, to folks with caregivers, on either side of the generational spectrum. And I saw a lot of dignity and autonomy given to individuals, faculty, staff, and students in the spaces in a virtual environment. And I'm concerned. I'm concerned as institutions push forward to this, back to normal, quote unquote. It's concerning as what will happen to those spaces of dignity that were created during the pandemic, and how can we break out of this antiquated thinking of the brick and mortar institution and become the innovative institution that we seek to be, and create these pockets of dignity for all.
Yes. Community. How do we tackle that one? Because it's very real. We learned a lot of our human needs, especially as a caregiver myself to a 8-year-old. Transition's been quite the journey. Wendy.
Yeah, I just wanted to go off of Shara's comment on this. I think and based on what other people have discussed, I think she's right. I think being virtual did provide a level of safety from the day-to-day microaggressions and violence that people experience, like when they enter white supremacist institutions at any level, whether that be the workplace, higher ed, or education, any given institution. But as we are asked to come back, I think there's more of an impetus that if you are asking people to come back from a safety that they found, it is your responsibility as the institution to ensure that that dignity and safety remains, if that's the direction it's pushing for, you know, the powers that be or the institution or whatever. The responsibility lies with the people in power to create the space so that that dignity and safety that was found virtually and away from that day-to-day violence, you're not detracting from that, right? Like, you need to be able to fill people's cup, not just take from them. So that's why I have a little bit of hesitation with like asking alumni to do things or asking people to come back into the classroom. It's not their responsibility. It's the responsibility of the institution to create the conditions that we need to thrive. It's not up to a former student. Like, they're living their lives. They're still carrying the legacies that Io outlined today, right? Particularly our students, particularly our alumni, are carrying the weight of all of that with them. They can't be asked to provide more labor to an institution that is responsible for doing that itself. So I don't know. Thank you, Shara, for bringing that up. I think it's a very important point to consider and to think about as people who work in the institution, because part of that responsibility lies on us to figure out how to get that done. And there are implications to that when it's also people of color who work here, but don't have decision-making power, right? So, you know, it's a nebulous terrain and like shaky terrain to navigate, but I think I maybe call it, you know, youthful naivete. I think we can do it.
I think we can too. I really do. But it's going to come through our level of precision. So how do we know we want spaces. How do we get deeper into that description so that it links back up to the structure? Does the structure have something called a space, or do they call it something else? Go for it, Hala.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, you know, I think that what I really appreciated about this series with IO is it's really putting names to things that have become almost implicit. And I think, you know, here at UC Merced especially, there's almost this sense of, you know, white supremacy doesn't work here. and it's because if it doesn't look the explicit way that it has historically looked, we don't think it's a thing anymore. But this series has really highlighted the ways that it's manifested in our lives in higher ed, and obviously in all the structures that exist outside of higher ed that contribute to the way that higher ed exists. And the series has been really powerful in aiding us in the ability to name it in the face of racial gaslighting that happens often. You know, you try to name it, you are made to feel like your reality is not real, and then you're back to square one. And hearkening back to what Shara was saying about, you know, the racial battle fatigue that happens being at work and in person, even though you might still encounter microaggressions virtually, there's a level of performance that you have to engage in constantly when you're in the office 8 to 5. Whereas Zoom, you can log off, go take a breath. And that space is valuable in a way that folks in positions of power and privilege can't see because they don't experience it in the same way. So I don't know that I also have the clear answer, but just this has strengthened my ability to point to and name the things, even when they're extremely implicit and sometimes difficult to name. And so I've been really appreciating the strengthened ability to do that.
And by the way, want to point out that every time I said structural racism, you could have substituted the phrase white supremacy. I avoid the term white supremacy because it closes down a lot of white people, but I use structural racism as a substitute, but you could have gone back there and substituted in white supremacy every single time I said structural racism.
Right. And even in that comment, It's how do we navigate to get to the goals that we want to get to, knowing that even the term white supremacy is a pitfall in terms of our advocacy agenda. That's part of the extra burden. That's part of the extra effort. That's part of the draining work. Yeah. We need time to take a breath. I'm enjoying hearing all of this. Debriefing is so important. They're with you, Karen. So with all said, anybody have some thoughts that kind of capture what's going on in our debrief to start bringing our conversation to the end? Who can do the meta analysis?
I don't know that I can do a full and solid meta-analysis, but I can give it a stab. I think what's been happening in the debrief is like a real effort to try to connect this to our day-to-day, because the concepts that IO is covering, again, I said this in the first seminar, is like a semester's worth of like a graduate level seminar. And so like to go from that like very macro level perspective that she's offering, it takes a lot of brain power and effort to like absorb, synthesize, and try to connect to our day-to-day. And so I appreciate the efforts, and I do appreciate people being vulnerable and sharing what they can, what they do, and how they're experiencing their work life, because I think it allows us to humanize each other, realize that real people work in the institution. And even though an institution will do what it has to do without the racists, right? Like it is our responsibility to figure out if there are no racists in the room, if I believe that, why is this still happening? What do I need to change? What do I need to fix to make sure that that doesn't happen again, that we're not hurting the very students we're here to support, or the people who look like the students we're here to support.
Beautiful. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, everyone who's been able to share. Thank you for those who are silently processing and building the bridges. Thank you for the comments in the chat, right? So I have a couple of words to close off the session and catch y'all in about 2 weeks. The journey to become an equity-minded, anti-racist practitioner in higher ed requires an understanding of our societal context. That's the work that IO's been doing. To challenge racism, we must understand what are the practices, what are the opinions, what are the values that hug racism in our offices and higher ed at large. We already know hands down that the work is not easy, but we invest the time to learn these foundational concepts, right? To know their definitions and nuances, because they are our tools, right? To tackle the major things that impact our day-to-day navigation. It is totally normal that we may not have the answers of how exactly are we going to create the spaces, be changing our hiring practices, so better support our students. We may not know the how immediately at this moment, but the more we engage in these conversations, the more we can craft that. So there is comfort, and this is an acknowledgement of not talking about race explicitly. This is a space OEDI and through partnership with IO is able to have these conversations. So more conversations are needed, more actions are needed, right? So with that, as you leave, it's critically vital to engage in spaces that cultivate, also with this work, radical healing for our multiple and intersecting lived experiences and social identities. Being a woman of color, right? Being a caregiver, whether it is to a child or someone else that is beloved in your life, right? This past year, I've been delving deeper into scholar Sean Jin Wright's radical healing framework, really thinking about agency, thinking about culture, thinking about values that allow communities of color to heal, right? But because the work is it just echoes so deeply with me. Yesterday, I actually took a step and picked up a new book. It's called Right Within: How to Heal from Racial Trauma in the Workplace by Minda Harts. And I picked it up yesterday because I know part of my role is to tackle policies, practices, and procedures for naming the black box that IO presented to us, right? But I also need the space to do the work to sustain my spirit and my love for this advocacy, right? So whether you find your releases in your social circle, Instagram, or other social media, books, or community events, remember that even as we learn these hard, complex, gradual level concepts, you're worthy of that healing practices as well. And the institution I was highlighting in this conversation must also integrate that as part of our efforts to challenge structural racism. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope after this you get a window, an opportunity to walk, process, read, whatever it is that you need to do. We'll catch you in a couple of weeks. Please, please, please help us continue to improve our implementation. So there is a survey, a mid-semester evaluation that was just dropped in the chat. You'll get it in the follow-up email too. But the more we can continue this relationship, this open, like this is what we want to see more of, this is what we want to change, this is what y'all are doing well, the better off we're going to do in terms of this building the collective culture at UC Merced. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. We appreciate you. We love you. We value you. Y'all are everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.